Hello, class, and welcome to week 3 of Group Dynamics. I trust that y'all are getting settled in and, excited for this first week of groups. I'm really excited about it too. So, like I said, we are not going to do lectures every single week, but I did want to do a few just so that, we could have a chance to connect and have that real community feeling. So, what I've decided to do is do kind of an every other week lecture type thing. So week 3, 5, and 7, we will have some lectures since y'all had the video, the syllabus video for the first week. So we'll just kind of jump into a couple things here. Of course, we know this is week 3, so by this point, y'all have been able to connect with all of your group members, had a chance to talk with them, develop a group schedule, and all these sorts of things. You are probably very well aware that this is the first week of doing our actual groups, which is really the heart of this class. And so y'all should have by now developed a schedule in terms of when y'all are meeting over the next few weeks, as well as who is leading each different group and, your group topics and making sure that you're in the week that you're teaching the group, that you are kind of studying up on the different skills that we're learning for that week. And just remember, if you're co-leading a group, there is sometimes that off chance where we have more than 4 people in a group. So if you're co-leading a group, make sure that you connect up with your co-leader to discuss how you're going to be leading the group and developing a plan. So that being said, also remember that there's quite a few assignments that have some kind of extra thought and attention and scheduling. So make sure that you're developing a plan to be able to kind of work towards getting those assignments complete in regards to scheduling, finding groups to go to, those sorts of things. So one of the things that I wanted to do this week is kind of piggyback off of the Cloud and Townsend text from last week in terms of some of the different characteristics of an effective group leader. And so I sometimes take concepts that are talked about in the book and then expand them. You'll notice that some of them aren't in the book. Really, my goal with these lectures is not to regurgitate the material that we've talked about, but rather kind of add on to it, kind of give some real life perspective, thoughts, all those fun sorts of things. So we're going to be talking about the different characteristics of an effective group leader. This would be small group, therapeutic group, those sorts of things, with, of course, specifically we're thinking therapeutic groups in mind here. I know that if you're doing like a church small group or those sorts of things, sometimes there's different requirements or things or characteristics that people look for. So for the purposes of this, we're going to be honing in specifically on therapeutic groups. So the first characteristic that I thought of in terms of kind of what is an effective group leader, or kind of what are the things that they do, and the first thing really is knowing yourself. And I know that sounds weird, but knowing yourself in terms of who are you as a group, or as a person, as a professional, and those sorts of things is one of the most important things you can do. There's an old saying, I think I heard it when I was back doing youth ministry, was that you can't take somebody where you haven't gone yourself. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we all have to know specifically different struggles that people have gone through in order to really be able to connect to them. But it does mean that you have a willingness and an openness to do your own work and to be able to kind of tackle issues from your past and present and those sorts of things, and in order to be able to effectively lead somebody in that direction. So of course, knowing yourself is going to be a big deal. What are your strengths? That's huge. What are your natural tendencies? And can you go against them? If you tend to be a confrontational person by nature, are you aware of that? And are you able to kind of hone that back in and kind of really tap into more of a nurturing and empathetic side? It's really good to know these sorts of things so that you can understand, hey, here's how I might come across in a group or individual therapeutic setting. Sometimes people don't connect to a really strong confrontational personality style. Sometimes they really are looking more for a nurturing and empathetic person, and not that you have to change yourself in by any way way or by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really kind of refining what is it that's intrinsically me and how can I kind of smooth the rough edges and those sorts of things. So knowing yourself, your natural tendencies, and knowing how can I go against them. If I tend to be a very nurturing person, do I need to maybe work on some of my confrontational skills? Not to bulldoze over somebody, but to be able to kind of stand up and to assert. Things like that. Another part of knowing yourself is understanding how do you handle conflict. Are you somebody who pursues it and who is maybe more of an aggressor and we're going to get this figured out? Or are you somebody who tends to withdraw and just kind of goes, if I can just kind of be silent, maybe that'll smooth the situation over and we don't have to, get into a big to-do about it. Knowing how you handle conflict is very important because that's going to come up in a group setting. Conflict. It's going to come up in any of your relationships, but when we're talking about group, conflict is really something that's quite pertinent because it is going to come up. And so understanding how I handle conflict is very important because that's going to be your gut reaction in the midst of a group conflict. So to know that and to be able to observe that in yourself and then potentially go against that in a group setting can be very, very helpful. Another thing that kind of goes along with knowing yourself is knowing what your own triggers are, as well as understanding how you would handle them if somebody has triggered you. So what I mean by triggers is all of us have different stories. No two of us are exactly alike. So there's all these different things, whether it's a look or a smell or talking about a specific type of situation, trigger words that just when they're said or done or we see them, they kind of hit a spot in us that kind of disorients us, or maybe it puts us on guard or on the defense or feeling like we need to react to somebody. And those are oftentimes the triggers that are very present that potentially need to be worked on in our own lives. But those come really a lot of times without us even knowing. I know there's been plenty of times where I've been sitting in sessions with a client and they'll say something that really hits me and goes, oh, that hits really close to home. For me, it's a matter of recognizing it and kind of tucking it in the back of my mind until I have a chance to process through that. But if I didn't recognize that those are what my triggers were, it's very possible that I could become very defensive or I could become very biased in a therapeutic situation because I'm not willing to deal with my own stuff. So understanding what your triggers are and how you would handle them, not if somebody triggers you, but when somebody triggers you is very important. Those triggers, when they hit that raw spot, are usually a fairly strong indicator of where our own work needs to happen. And if we have been doing work in that area already, it's recognizing that we have and that potentially we might need to come back to that at some point and kind of really deal with that issue. So that's part of knowing yourself as a therapist. And then I kind of have a resource. One of them we're going to talk a little bit more about at length in kind of the resources section of this lecture video. But I just kind of came up with a couple resources to how do I get to know myself? Kind of if I've never really kind of dug into that and who I am as a therapist and as a person and some of my issues and why I might do things the way that I do. There's some really fabulous personality tests and inventories out there. The Enneagram, which I'm going to skip over a little bit right now because we'll go over that later on. There's a DISC test. There's a Strengths Finders test, Myers-Briggs. All of these have free forms online if you Google them, Myers-Briggs free test. And you can take them. It takes about 10 minutes. It's usually pretty fascinating to kind of hear about yourself. And I will say a lot of times if we're reading something and we find ourselves very averted to it, it's often an indication that that is probably pretty close to our personality. We tend to kind of, I don't really want to be that, or that doesn't describe me. And oftentimes it really can. So I'm just going to set that as a disclaimer. But using those inventories as ways to really figure out more of who you are and how you deal with things can be very, very helpful, both personally and professionally. So that's the first part about being an effective leader, is that they are somebody who knows themselves. Secondly, in a group setting, you are a facilitator. So the unique part about being a group leader is more that you get to be a facilitator rather than having to lead all the time. So you're kind of that person who's guiding the discussion, you're maybe asking prompting questions, directing kind of the structure rather than having to plan every single minute of the group. So I wanted to give you guys kind of an experience that I have had in being a group leader or facilitator. As I've mentioned in kind of my bio and getting to know me, my internship for grad school was done at an outpatient sex offender treatment center. So I worked with convicted adult and juvenile sex offenders doing group couples work, family work, and individual work. So these were people who had already served their time in jail, and this was part of their rehabilitative process. They were all on probation. And so we would do weekly groups that they had to attend, and then oftentimes we would do individual or couple or families work depending on the person. So I was a facilitator of several of these groups. It was a really, really wonderful experience. Later on in the class, you'll hear about a really terrible group experience I had when I was in school. And so because of that, I was really, really skittish to begin my time as a group leader here at this treatment center. But I ended up having a really wonderful experience, and as a result, learned a lot about myself and groups in general. So now granted, this is a group of men who have all been caught and charged and served time for committing a sex offense in some capacity, or multiple sex offenses, depending on the person. So they had a mantra in their group, and this kind of plays into me as a facilitator. They had a mantra, and pardon my language, but they would say, "You can't bullshit a bullshitter." Okay, so I loved that. It was my job to keep them on track. What that mantra meant is that they were very willing to call each other out. They understood how other sex offenders thought, and so they could tell if somebody was kind of trying to pull the wool over their eyes or give an excuse or justification. They were very quick to kind of jump on that, to call that person out, and to hold them accountable. It was usually done in a really healthy, therapeutic way. Now, it was my job to make sure that it didn't get out of hand as a facilitator, but that's kind of the unique piece, is that oftentimes the group members are the ones who actually do a bulk of the therapeutic work, and you're just kind of keeping them in line. So I kept them on track with their assignments, ensuring that we didn't get off topic. As they confronted each other, they taught each other. So I could help them process whatever that confrontation was after it happened. Also, my job as that facilitator was that I oftentimes was the one who came in and brought in an empathetic viewpoint. So a lot of times I would find myself saying something like, gosh, can you imagine what it must have felt like to be so manipulated in that circumstance? My goal really was to help them develop a sense of empathy. And so oftentimes they could focus on the facts and the excuses and the justifications and all those sorts of things. So my job, I felt, was to really kind of bring it to a deeper level and then have everybody kind of process that. And of course, as a facilitator, my job truly was to keep the structure of the group. So the groups were very assignment-based. It was an assignment-based processing groups. So a lot of times the learning and discussion was based off of whose assignments were being shared. And so I really kept track and kept flow of those sorts of things. But then, like I said, so much of the discussion happened as a result of that, with each person then sharing their own experiences. So that's kind of my experience as a facilitator of a group, and you can kind of see there's a lot of fluidity. It's very dependent on what people are bringing to the room that day. And really, my job is to just kind of maintain the structure rather than to have to plan every single moment. So that's part of a great group leader. Another thing to remember as a great group leader is that this isn't your group, okay? What I mean by that is that if you notice yourself getting triggered, like we talked about before, this is probably something that you're going to need to work on. And so noticing that and then potentially finding your own venues for working those issues out is going to be very important, because it's not your job as the facilitator to kind of bring your own issues to the group. The second part of that is that the goal of the group is not to get everybody to believe or act or think or experience things the same way that you do. Regardless of if this is a church group or a therapeutic group or a community group or whatever that is, groups typically tend not to be with the purpose of kind of really kind of a rigid track of here's what my group leader believes and the group leader really kind of pushes that, and there really isn't a room for deviating outside of that. And really with that, so much of a group, sometimes the process or sometimes it's more about the journey of the process than really getting through a lesson plan. So I know as a group leader, it can feel like, oh, I got to get through all of this stuff. But, so much of it is really letting the person kind of sit in that moment and process and experience the journey rather than just having to get steps 1 through 8 done in this group session. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here, and then we'll pick up in just a moment.